Great to see everybody here today. Thank you for coming, and it's a real privilege and an honor and a pleasure to be at this important conference on personhood, animal personhood, or personhood beyond the human. I'm not going to be showing an entire PowerPoint slideshow today, but I do at least want to get a few pictures here for you to bear in mind. And I have passed out a paper that I wrote that is now in an anthology titled Experiencing Animal Minds, about my 25, 30-year experience living directly with chickens, observing them, interacting with them, and so forth, and turkeys as well, that hopefully you can read when you have time, and that you will read to get a perspective on chickens that is often missing even from the animal advocacy discourse, as well as frequently in academia as well. I also am passing out to you the essay about the chicken who was really responsible for my starting United Poultry Concerns in 1990, dedicated to the compassionate and respectful treatment of domestic fowl, representing those birds who have the misfortune to be considered a food source by most of the human species. However, I am going to today address some issues relating to the theme of personhood, and I will reiterate the title of my presentation, which is The Provocative Elitism of Personhood, quote unquote, for non-human creatures in animal advocacy parlance and polemics. So in the 1980s, Peter Singer's book Animal Liberation was the Bible of the burgeoning animal advocacy movement. His argument was lucid and compelling. And by the way, it was in the early 1980s, specifically 1983, that I became officially involved in the animal advocacy movement in the United States. Singer said that non-human animals, being sentient, have interests the same as humans, and that it is wrong to sacrifice their important interests to humanity's trivial ones. He said that consideration of animals' interests is a matter of logic, reason, justice, and morality, not just sentimentality. This formula provided the bold, principled approach to animal advocacy that was needed to inspire a movement. Yet even in the process of promoting animal liberation and criticizing the traditional hierarchy of nature set forth by Aristotle and others, Singer has consistently maintained a presumption of human superiority over all other forms of life, a presumption that continues to adversely affect the animal advocacy movement. The hierarchy, the great scale of being, as it were, starts with mentally competent adult human beings, proceeding down to the quote-unquote lowest life forms. The chief point of suffering between humans and other animals is suffering. Yet over time, even suffering of animals could not compete with the superior suffering of human beings in Singer's perspective, wherein personhood became a touchstone. In Rethinking Life and Death, published in 1994, personhood is represented as a privileged identity to which only mentally competent adult humans and the great apes are definitively entitled, with the great apes far below humans in this perspective. In the 2011 revised edition of Practical Ethics by Singer, certain other animals, including some wild birds, are said to perhaps be eligible to be granted some degree of personhood based on laboratory experiments and field observations showing that they possess a measure of, again, quote unquote, 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 rationality, self-awareness, and future-directed thinking and desires, quote unquote. However, a sentient non-person or merely conscious being does not qualify, in Singer's view, to what he calls a right to life in the full sense. One of the points I want to make about the whole idea of personhood and how we judge which animals are worthy to be deemed persons by our species. First of all, as in my title, this is a very elitist perspective in which we privilege ourselves above every other form of existence on the earth and even in the universe. Secondly, as I wrote back in the 1980s in an essay titled Expanding the Great, or maybe it was the early 90s, Expanding the Great Ape Project, Equality Beyond Primatology, I pointed out how in the 1970s and the 1980s, efforts were made, as most of you know, to try to communicate with non-human primates through human verbal language. And the method that was finally adopted is American Sign Language, or what they call Ameslan. The idea was that if chimpanzees could learn this version of human language and devise clever strategies using this language, therefore they would be considered to have a higher status than virtually all other animals. But one of the things that I pointed out is that an important fact about the chimpanzee's ability to use Ameslan as a method of sort of verbal, or as if verbal language with speaking with human beings, is that the ability of the chimpanzee to use Ameslan depends on an anatomical feature that resembles one of ours, which is manual dexterity. Thus, no matter how unique, intelligent, or willing they may be, any animal having fins, paws, hooves, or claws cannot learn to use, even if capable of fully understanding, Ameslan. So one of the things that we are looking at here is the anatomical and physiological difference in structure, evolved structure of other animals, and how their structures of expression within their bodies and as part of their psyches are going to be able to prove to us that they are worthy of being persons. And of course, the whole idea of who is worthy and unworthy is itself 100% problematic. Chimpanzees appear to be physiologically and anatomically ill-adapted to using, however competent of understanding, verbal language. And I say verbal language because, unfortunately, there is a tendency for us to assume that language, all the languages of life on Earth, are not really languages, that only human verbal speech constitutes language, which is, again, itself a prejudice in the highest degree, and a false view of what languages really are amongst creatures. So in other words, even the chimpanzee, even the non-human primate, doesn't have the anatomical, physiological features that will enable that animal to use human verbal language. It has nothing to do with whether that type of creature can understand human verbal language or fully understand what we're saying, but they're created differently in their bodies so that they cannot prove to us through human verbal language that they understand, are communicating, etc. And again, when we get to other anatomical features such as hooves, claws, wings, etc., fins, the problem, I think, is self-evident. I argue that categorizing animals and dividing them up into who is rational, self-aware, future-oriented, a sentient non-person, or merely a conscious being, etc., that such categorizing relegates the entire animal kingdom, apart from humans, to a condition of mental disability that is totally incompatible with the cognitive demands exacted upon real animals in the real world. I have taken issue for decades with the, at least the strategy, if not the belief amongst many animal advocates desperate to try to get a public hearing to animals and for animals, that adult human or non-human animals, that their intelligence, that their cognitive capacities are equivalent to a human toddler or a mentally disabled human being. And my point is very clear and simple here, and very logical and rational. You do not compare the incompetent capacities of one species with the competent capacities of another species. By incompetent, I mean incompetent by virtue of age, that one is only a toddler or an infant or a 7-year-old, or that one has a cognitive disability, and say that a fully capable, cognitively developed and active member of the parrot family or the chimpanzee family or the chicken family, that somehow there's an analogy there. That is not a correct analogy. It is neither logical nor just. So we need to get out of the habit of trying to win favor for animals, non-human, other than human animals, by demeaning them in every possible way, or any possible way, one way of which is comparing them, adult, capable, non-human animals, mothers, fathers, raising their young, negotiating complex environments, having to make decisions all day long, every day, with incompetent members of our society. Human children do not create viable, sustainable societies lasting over thousands and sometimes tens of thousands or even millions of years, as is the case with so many animal species on our planet. Mentally challenged people do not create viable, sustainable societies in their own right. Now, I realize that the word mentally challenged is too general to really, it's unfairly too general, but I'm just using a term for sort of like as a, quick term that I hope everybody understands, that there are so many degrees and variations on mentally challenged. Nonetheless, the argument holds. So as I say here, the illogic of comparing cognitively incapacitated humans by virtue of age or disability with
cognitively intact and capable members of other species illogically implies that a cerebral and experiential equivalence between the mentally incompetent members of our species and the mentally competent, fully functioning members of other species. Actually, I mean, if you think of like a mother chicken hen, her mind is, she's got the mind of being a mother, of, again, making all kinds of complex decisions, social decisions, familial decisions. So there's no actual comparability between the way her cognitive nature is developed, structured, and functioning with that of a 7-year-old child, a human child. There's just no comparison there at all. So this kind of thinking, this deleterious if well-meaning type of thinking, but fatuous focus on an animal's ability or inability, it leads to this idea, if this animal can play video games, then that animal must be a smarter animal. Solemn pronouncements about the latest laboratory, quote-unquote, findings that adult pigs and chickens are, quote-unquote, as smart as toddlers. You know, I find that very demeaning, and I don't subscribe to that type of analogy because I think it's false and inaccurate and so totally unjust to the members of other species. 1 minute or 4 or what? Okay. So one thing I want to read to you now, I passed out to you, as I mentioned, a paper that I wrote that is on our website at upc-online.org, which is included here in the literature. My essay on our website is titled The Social Life of Chickens, in which I, instead of invoking what science says here and science says there and what this academic person said here and there, I simply wrote a paper in which I described and evoked the experience I have had with chickens since 1985. interacting on a daily basis, loving these birds, caring for these birds, rescuing these birds, rehabilitating these birds, having the joy and privilege of sharing their lives in our sanctuary. And I actually started keeping chickens 5 years before officially starting United Poultry Concerns in 1990. So I'm just going to read to you briefly, since we hear so much about, well, one proof or one indication of an animal's being able to have demonstrate self-awareness and awareness of him or herself is the way the animal responds to looking in the mirror at him or herself. So here's what I wrote, an example of what I have written on that subject. Chickens, in my experience, have a core identity and sense of themselves as chickens. An example is a chick I named Fred, sole survivor of a classroom hatching project in which embryos are hatched in mechanical incubators. Fred was so large, loud, and demanding from the moment he set foot in our house that I assumed he would grow up and be a rooster. That was a sexist assumption. He's so lively, he must be a male, right? He raced up and down the hallway, hopped up on my shoulder, leapt to the top of my head, ran across my back, drew down my arm and onto the floor when I was at the computer, and generally was what you would call pushy, albeit adorably so. I remember one day putting Fred outdoors in an enclosure with a few adult hens on the ground, and he flew straight up to the top branch of the tree, peeping loudly, apparently wanting no part of those hens. Fred grew into a lustrously beautiful black hen, whom I renamed Fredaflower. Often, Fredaflower and I would sit on the sofa together at night while I watched television or read. Even by herself, Fredaflower liked to perch on the arm of the sofa in front of the TV when it was on, suggesting that she liked to be there because it was our special place. She ran up and down the stairs to the second floor of our house as she pleased, and often I would find her in the guest room, standing prettily in front of a full-length mirror, preening her feathers and observing herself. She appeared to be fully aware that it was she herself she was looking at in the mirror. And I would say to her, "Look, Fredaflower, that's you. Look how pretty you are." And she seemed already to know that. Fredaflower loved for me to hold and pet her. She demanded to be picked up. She would close her eyes and purr while I stroked her feathers and kissed her face. From time to time, I placed her outside in the chicken yard, and sometimes she ventured out on her own, but she always came back. Eventually, I noticed she was returning to me less and less, and for shorter periods. One night, she elected to remain in the chicken house with the flock. From then on until she died of ovarian cancer in my arms 2 years later, Fredaflower expressed her ambivalence of wanting to be with me, but also wanting to be with the other hens, to socialize and nest with them, and participate in their world and the reliving of ancestral experiences that she carried within herself. So, thank you.